What drives ordinary people to abandon everything they know and follow charismatic leaders into darkness? If you're fascinated by the psychology behind history's most notorious cults and want to understand how manipulation, control, and tragedy unfold in real time, you've found the right place. Hit that subscribe button right now because we're about to dive deep into stories that will challenge everything you think you know about human nature, religious freedom, and the dangerous power of blind faith. I'm Boring Nightmares, and this is where we explore the twisted minds and devastating consequences of the world's deadliest. From the moment you hear the phrase religious movement, your mind probably conjures images of peaceful congregations, Sunday services, and communities built on love and faith. But what happens when that faith becomes weaponized? When spiritual leaders demand absolute obedience, not to a higher power, but to themselves? When salvation becomes a commodity sold through manipulation, abuse, and terror? Today, we're diving into the darkest corners of human psychology and exploring three organizations that masqueraded as religious movements while orchestrating some of the most systematic forms of psychological warfare ever documented. The Aggressive Christianity Missionary Training Corps, the Church of Scientology, and NXLCVM represent a chilling evolution in how charismatic leaders can exploit our deepest spiritual needs to create empires built on suffering. These aren't just stories about bad people doing bad things. These are case studies in how ordinary individuals searching for meaning, purpose, and community can be gradually transformed into willing participants in their own destruction. The techniques used by these groups are so sophisticated, so psychologically precise, that they've actually informed our modern understanding of coercive control and psychological manipulation. What makes these organizations particularly dangerous isn't just what they did to their members, but how they perfected the art of making their victims grateful for the abuse. The Aggressive Christianity Missionary Training Corps emerged in the 1980s as what appeared to be a fundamentalist Christian organization dedicated to training missionaries for dangerous overseas work. Founded by Jim and Lila Green in Fence Lake, New Mexico, the group attracted young people seeking adventure, purpose, and a way to serve God in the world's most challenging environments. The Greens presented themselves as spiritual warriors, preparing soldiers for Christ to battle evil in places where conventional missionaries feared to tread. Their compound in the remote New Mexico desert became home to hundreds of young believers who thought they were joining an elite Christian Special Forces unit. But behind the military-style training and biblical rhetoric lay something far more sinister. The Aggressive Christianity Missionary Training Corps wasn't training missionaries. It was creating a private army of psychologically conditioned followers who would do anything their leaders commanded. The daily routine at the compound was designed to break down individual identity and rebuild members as unquestioning extensions of the Greens' will. Members were subjected to extreme physical training, sleep deprivation, and constant psychological pressure. They were taught that questioning leadership was equivalent to questioning God himself. The Greens implemented a system they called Holy Ghost machine gun preaching, where members would be subjected to hours of screaming, aggressive sermons designed to induce altered states of consciousness. During these sessions, people would collapse, convulse, and experience what they believed were divine visions. In reality, these were carefully orchestrated psychological breakdowns that left members more susceptible to control. The compound operated under martial law, with the Greens as supreme commanders whose word was literally treated as divine revelation. What made the aggressive Christianity Missionary Training Corps particularly insidious was how it weaponized legitimate Christian beliefs. Members weren't just following a charismatic leader, they genuinely believed they were serving God. The Greens taught that their organization was engaged in spiritual warfare against Satan, and that any opposition to their methods was demonic in origin. This created a closed system of belief where criticism was impossible because it was automatically categorized as evil. The psychological conditioning was methodical and devastating. New members underwent what the organization called death to self training, where they were systematically stripped of their personal identity, relationships, and decision-making ability. They were taught that their previous lives, including relationships with family members who weren't part of the organization, were obstacles to their spiritual development. Members were required to cut ties with outside friends and family, creating complete dependence on the group for social connection and emotional support. The physical conditions at the compound were deliberately harsh. Members lived in overcrowded barracks with minimal food and inadequate sanitation. They were told that comfort was a sign of spiritual weakness and that suffering was necessary for spiritual growth. The Greens so lived in luxury while their followers endured deprivation, but members were taught that this disparity was evidence of their leaders' special spiritual status. Children born into the organization faced particularly severe abuse. They were raised communally, with minimal contact with their biological parents, and subjected to extreme discipline for minor infractions. Education was limited to religious indoctrination, leaving children completely unprepared for life outside the compound. Many children who eventually escaped the organization struggled for years to develop basic social skills and educational foundations. The organization's missionary work was largely fictional. While members were told they were being prepared for dangerous overseas assignments, most never left the compound. Those who did participate in overseas activities were often involved in the Greens' business ventures rather than legitimate missionary work. The organization used its religious status to avoid scrutiny while operating what was essentially a labor camp where members worked for free to enrich their leaders. The psychological techniques used by the aggressive Christianity Missionary Training Corps were remarkably sophisticated. The Greens understood that the most effective way to control people wasn't through force alone, but through convincing them that their suffering was voluntary and meaningful. Members were taught that their hardships were evidence of their spiritual dedication and that questioning their treatment was a sign of spiritual weakness. This created a psychological trap where the worse conditions became, the more members believed they were proving their faith. The organization also employed what psychologists now recognize as trauma bonding. Members were subjected to intense stress and then provided with relief and comfort by the same leaders who had caused their suffering. This created powerful emotional attachments that were difficult to break, even when members intellectually understood they were being mistreated. The Greens positioned themselves as both the source of members' problems and their only solution, creating a dependency that was both practical and psychological. What made escape particularly difficult was the organization's isolation from mainstream society. The compound was located in a remote area with limited outside contact, and members were discouraged from maintaining relationships with people outside the organization. This physical and social isolation made it extremely difficult for members to seek help or even recognize that they needed help. The Greens created an alternate reality where their extreme practices seemed normal and necessary. The organization's downfall began when former members started speaking out about their experiences. Despite the psychological conditioning and isolation, some members eventually recognized the abuse and found the courage to leave. These whistleblowers provided crucial information to law enforcement and helped expose the organization's true nature. The process of bringing the Greens to justice was complicated by the organization's religious claims and the difficulty of prosecuting psychological abuse. The impact on former members was devastating and long-lasting. Many struggled with post-traumatic stress disorder, difficulty forming healthy relationships, and challenges reintegrating into mainstream society. Some had been in the organization for so long that they had no experience with normal social interactions or practical life skills. The psychological damage was compounded by the fact that many members had genuinely believed they were serving God and had to grapple with feeling betrayed, not just by their leaders, but by their own faith. The aggressive Christianity Missionary Training Corps represents a particularly insidious form of cult manipulation because it exploited people's desire to serve God and make a positive difference in the world. Unlike organizations that promise wealth or power, the Greens attracted followers by appealing to their highest moral aspirations. This made the eventual realization of abuse even more devastating, as members had to confront the fact that their sincere spiritual seeking had been manipulated and exploited. The techniques pioneered by the aggressive Christianity Missionary Training Corps have been studied by psychologists and cult experts as examples of how religious language and imagery can be weaponized to create systems of control. The organization demonstrated how legitimate spiritual concepts like sacrifice, obedience, and faith can be twisted into tools of psychological manipulation. Understanding these techniques is crucial for recognizing similar patterns in other organizations and protecting vulnerable individuals from exploitation. The legacy of the aggressive Christianity Missionary Training Corps serves as a stark reminder that the most dangerous cults often present themselves as the most righteous organizations. They prey on people's genuine desire for meaning, purpose, and spiritual connection, using these noble impulses as weapons against their victims. Now let's explore our second deadly cult, one that has manipulated minds and destroyed lives on a global scale for over 7 decades. The Church of Scientology presents itself as a religion offering spiritual enlightenment and personal improvement. But beneath this veneer lies a sophisticated system of psychological manipulation, financial exploitation, and systematic abuse that has ensnared countless victims worldwide. Founded in 1954 by science fiction writer L. Ron Hubbard, Scientology emerged from his earlier work called Dianetics, which he promoted as a revolutionary approach to mental health. Hubbard, a charismatic but deeply troubled individual with a history of making grandiose claims about his military service and academic achievements, created what would become one of the most controversial and dangerous organizations in modern history. What makes Scientology particularly insidious is how it weaponizes the genuine human desire for self-improvement and spiritual growth, turning these noble aspirations into tools of control and exploitation. The organization operates through a complex hierarchy of courses, auditing sessions, and levels of spiritual advancement that can cost members hundreds of thousands of dollars over their lifetime. New recruits are typically drawn in through personality tests offered on street corners or through online advertisements promising to help people overcome their limitations and achieve their full potential. These initial contacts seem harmless, even helpful, but they represent the first step in a carefully orchestrated process designed to identify vulnerable individuals and gradually separate them from their critical thinking abilities, financial resources, and support networks. The core practice of Scientology is called auditing, a process where members are questioned extensively about their personal lives, fears, secrets, and past experiences while connected to a device called an e-meter, which Scientologists claim can detect lies and spiritual disturbances. These sessions, which can last for hours, are supposedly designed to help individuals clear themselves of negative influences and achieve higher states of spiritual awareness. However, former members reveal that auditing serves a far more sinister purpose, gathering compromising information that can later be used to control, manipulate, or silence members who might consider leaving or speaking out against the organization. Every detail shared during auditing sessions is meticulously recorded in folders that the organization maintains on each member. These files often contain the most intimate details of a person's life, including sexual experiences, family problems, criminal activities, and deepest fears. Former Scientologists describe how this information becomes a weapon used against them, with the organization threatening to expose embarrassing or damaging details if members attempt to leave or criticize the group. This practice of gathering and weaponizing personal information creates a climate of fear and ensures compliance even among members who begin to question the organization's methods or motives. The financial exploitation within Scientology is breathtaking in its scope and ruthlessness. New members are constantly pressured to purchase more courses, additional auditing sessions, and various materials needed to advance to higher levels within the organization. These costs escalate dramatically as members progress, with some advanced courses costing tens of thousands of dollars each. Former members describe being pushed to take out loans, mortgage their homes, or liquidate their retirement savings to pay for Scientology services. The organization employs high-pressure sales tactics, emotional manipulation, and the promise of spiritual advancement to extract money from members, often leaving them financially devastated. What makes this financial exploitation particularly cruel is how it preys on people's deepest spiritual and personal needs. Members are told that their financial sacrifice demonstrates their commitment to their spiritual growth, and that failing to pay for courses or auditing will prevent them from achieving salvation or spiritual freedom. Those who express concern about the costs are made to feel guilty or spiritually inadequate, with the organization suggesting that their reluctance to pay stems from their own spiritual failings rather than legitimate financial concerns. The organization's treatment of children represents one of its most disturbing aspects. Children born into Scientology families are often denied normal educational and social opportunities, instead being funneled into the organization's own educational programs that emphasize Scientology doctrine over conventional learning. Many are recruited into the Sea organization, Scientology's elite inner circle, where they sign billion-year contracts and are subjected to harsh living conditions, minimal pay, and complete separation from their families. Former members describe children as young as 12 being forced to work long hours, subjected to adult responsibilities, and punished severely for minor infractions. The Sea organization itself represents perhaps the most extreme manifestation of Scientology's controlling nature. Members live in dormitory-style accommodations, work 16-hour days for minimal pay, and are subject to constant surveillance and control. They are forbidden from having children, and those who become pregnant are pressured to have abortions. Communication with family members outside the organization is strictly controlled, and members are discouraged from maintaining relationships that might interfere with their dedication to Scientology. The living conditions are often described as prison-like, with members sleeping in overcrowded rooms, eating poor quality food, and having virtually no personal freedom or privacy. Scientology's approach to handling criticism or dissent is particularly aggressive and systematic. The organization maintains what it calls the Office of Special Affairs, which serves as its intelligence and legal warfare division. This department is responsible for investigating, harassing, and destroying the lives of former members who speak out, journalists who write critical articles, and government officials who attempt to investigate the organization. Their tactics include hiring private investigators to follow critics, filing numerous lawsuits to drain opponents' financial resources, spreading false information about critics' personal lives, and using the compromising information gathered during auditing sessions to discredit former members. The organization's policy of disconnection represents one of its most psychologically devastating control mechanisms. Members who leave Scientology or are declared suppressive persons are completely cut off from all contact with family members and friends who remain in the organization. This policy tears apart families and friendships, leaving former members isolated and emotionally devastated. Parents are forced to choose between maintaining relationships with their children and remaining in Scientology, while spouses face the destruction of their marriages if one partner decides to leave. This enforced separation serves as both punishment for those who leave and a powerful deterrent for those considering departure. The psychological impact of Scientology membership extends far beyond the immediate experience of being in the organization. Former members often struggle with depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder as they attempt to rebuild their lives after leaving. Many describe feeling completely unprepared for life outside the organization, having been isolated from mainstream society and dependent on Scientology for their sense of identity, purpose, and community. The process of recovering from Scientology involvement often requires years of therapy and support as former members work to reclaim their critical thinking abilities, rebuild their self-esteem, and establish healthy relationships. The organization's legal strategy represents another weapon in its arsenal of control and intimidation. Scientology has filed thousands of lawsuits against critics, former members, and government agencies, using its vast financial resources to wage legal warfare designed to silence opposition rather than seek justice. They employ teams of expensive lawyers to file frivolous lawsuits, appeal adverse decisions endlessly, and generally make the legal process so expensive and time-consuming that opponents give up rather than continue fighting. This strategy has been remarkably effective in suppressing criticism and investigation, as few individuals or organizations have the resources to withstand prolonged legal battles with Scientology. Despite decades of controversy and numerous exposés by former members, journalists, and documentary filmmakers, Scientology continues to operate and recruit new members around the world. The organization maintains its tax-exempt religious status in the United States, giving it significant legal protections and financial advantages. It continues to operate celebrity centers that recruit high-profile members whose fame and influence help legitimize the organization and attract new recruits. The involvement of celebrities like Tom Cruise and John Travolta provides Scientology with enormous publicity value and helps deflect criticism by associating the organization with successful, admired public figures. The international scope of Scientology's operations makes addressing its abuses particularly challenging. The organization operates in dozens of countries, often adapting its methods to local legal and cultural conditions while maintaining its core practices of psychological manipulation and financial exploitation. In some countries, Scientology has been banned or restricted, while in others it operates with minimal oversight. This international presence allows the organization to move resources and personnel between countries to avoid legal consequences and continue its operations even when facing investigations or restrictions in particular jurisdictions. Former members who have found the courage to speak out describe the enormous difficulty of rebuilding their lives after leaving Scientology. Many have lost their entire social networks, their careers, and their financial security. They face the challenge of learning to think critically again after years of having their thoughts controlled and monitored. Some struggle with basic life skills that were handled by the organization during their membership. The psychological recovery process is often complicated by the shame and embarrassment of having been deceived and manipulated, as well as by the organization's ongoing harassment and attempts to discredit their testimonies. The tragic stories of those who have died while involved with Scientology highlight the organization's dangerous disregard for member welfare. Cases like that of Lisa McPherson, who died in 1995 after being held by Scientologists for 17 days without proper medical care, illustrate how the organization's beliefs and practices can have fatal consequences. Scientology's opposition to psychiatric treatment and medication has prevented members from receiving necessary mental health care, while the organization's emphasis on handling all problems through Scientology methods has led to the neglect of serious medical and psychological conditions. Understanding Scientology requires recognizing how it exploits fundamental human needs and vulnerabilities. People join Scientology seeking answers to life's problems, hoping to improve themselves, or looking for a sense of community and belonging. The organization's initial presentations can seem reasonable and helpful, offering practical solutions to common problems and promising enhanced abilities and spiritual awareness. It's only gradually that members discover the true cost of involvement, both financially and personally, and by then they are often too deeply embedded in the system to easily escape. The Church of Scientology represents a masterclass in large-scale psychological manipulation and exploitation. It demonstrates how charismatic leadership, sophisticated recruitment techniques, gradual indoctrination, financial pressure, information control, and social isolation can be combined to create a system that traps people for years or even decades. Now, shifting our focus to the third organization on our list, we encounter what many consider one of the most insidious and sophisticated manipulation machines ever created under the guise of personal development. NISM, pronounced Nexium, presented itself as an executive coaching program promising to unlock human potential and eliminate psychological limitations. Founded by Keith Raniere in 1998, this organization attracted successful professionals, celebrities, and ambitious individuals seeking self-improvement and leadership training. What made NXIVM particularly dangerous was its ability to hide in plain sight. Unlike the overtly religious framing of aggressive Christianity or the science fiction trappings of Scientology, NXIVM marketed itself as a rational, scientific approach to personal growth. The organization offered expensive seminars called executive success programs that cost thousands of dollars and promised to remove mental blocks that prevented success and happiness. Keith Raniere positioned himself as Vanguard, a brilliant philosopher whose teachings could revolutionize human consciousness. His followers, particularly the inner circle of women, were encouraged to view him as intellectually superior to virtually anyone else on Earth. Raniere claimed to have one of the highest IQs ever recorded and positioned his teachings as breakthrough insights into human psychology and ethics. The recruitment process began innocuously enough. The initial courses seemed legitimate, focusing on goal setting, communication skills, and overcoming limiting beliefs. Participants paid substantial fees for multi-day intensive workshops that promised dramatic personal transformation. However, the true nature of NXIVM revealed itself gradually through a process of progressive commitment and isolation. As members advanced through higher levels of training, they were required to make increasingly significant sacrifices. Time commitments expanded from weekend workshops to weeks-long intensives. Financial obligations grew from thousands to tens of thousands of dollars. The psychological manipulation employed by NXIVM was extraordinarily sophisticated. Members were subjected to intensive questioning sessions designed to break down their psychological defenses and create emotional dependency on the group. These sessions, called explorations, involved hours of aggressive interrogation where participants were forced to confess their deepest fears, shameful memories, and perceived character flaws. Raniere and his lieutenants used this personal information as leverage for control. Members who attempted to leave or question the organization found their most intimate secrets threatened to be exposed. The group maintained detailed files on each member's psychological vulnerabilities, sexual history, and family relationships. This information became a form of insurance, ensuring that members remained compliant and silent about what they witnessed within the organization. This clandestine group, operating within NXIVM's upper levels, functioned as a sex trafficking operation, disguised as female empowerment. Women recruited into Daoist were told they were joining an exclusive sisterhood designed to help them overcome weaknesses and achieve their full potential. New recruits were required to provide collateral before joining, compromising material such as nude photographs, damaging information about family members, or false confessions to serious crimes. They were told this collateral would only be released if they broke their commitment to the sisterhood. Once inducted, DOS members were subjected to increasingly extreme demands. They were required to follow strict diets that left them severely underweight, maintain punishing exercise regimens, and be available to their masters at any hour of the day or night. Many were coerced into sexual relationships with Keith Ranieres, who positioned himself as the ultimate master of the entire DOS hierarchy. Perhaps most horrifically, many DOS members were subjected to branding ceremonies, where Raniere's initials were burned into their skin near their pelvic area. These ceremonies were presented as empowering rituals of commitment, but victims later described them as traumatic experiences conducted without proper medical supervision or adequate pain management. The women were held down naked while the branding was performed, often accompanied by videotaping that created additional compromising material for the organization's use. The control mechanisms employed by NXIVM extended far beyond psychological manipulation. The organization used sophisticated legal strategies to intimidate critics and escapees. They filed numerous lawsuits against former members, journalists, and anyone who spoke publicly about their experiences. These legal actions, funded by the substantial assets of wealthy members, were designed to financially exhaust opponents and create a chilling effect that discouraged others from coming forward. NXIVM also employed private investigators to conduct surveillance on critics and former members. These investigators would follow people, photograph their activities, and gather information about their personal lives that could be used for intimidation or discrediting. Former members reported feeling constantly watched and threatened, creating a climate of fear that persisted long after they left the organization. The organization's financial structure was designed to extract maximum resources from members while providing minimal accountability. Advanced courses could cost $10,000 or more, and members were encouraged to take out loans, liquidate savings, and then even mortgage their homes to pay for training. Wealthy members like Seagram's heiress Claire Bronfman contributed millions of dollars that funded the organization's legal battles and Raniere's lavish lifestyle. Members were also pressured to recruit others, creating a multi-level marketing structure that generated substantial revenue. Those who brought in new members or convinced existing members to take additional courses received recognition and advancement within the organization's hierarchy. This created a system where members became financially invested in the organization's success and complicit in its expansion. The psychological damage inflicted by NXIVM was profound and long-lasting. Former members describe experiencing severe anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress symptoms after leaving. Many struggled with feelings of shame and self-blame, questioning their own judgment and ability to make decisions. The intensive psychological manipulation had altered their sense of reality and self-worth in ways that required years of therapy to address. Particularly tragic were the impacts on families torn apart by NXIVM's influence. Parents watched helplessly as adult children became increasingly isolated and financially drained by their involvement. Marriages dissolved when one spouse became deeply involved, while the other recognized the organization's harmful nature. Children were sometimes brought into NXIVM's sphere through their parents' involvement, exposing them to inappropriate adult content and psychological manipulation. The organization's ultimate downfall began when several courageous women came forward to expose DOS and the sexual abuse occurring within NXIVM. These whistleblowers faced enormous personal risk, knowing that the organization possessed compromising material about them and had demonstrated willingness to use aggressive legal tactics against critics. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of NXIVM's criminal enterprise. Federal authorities found evidence of sex trafficking, forced labor, racketeering, and other serious crimes. Keith Raniere was arrested in Mexico in 2018 and later sentenced to 120 years in prison. Several of his co-conspirators, including actress Allison Mack and Seagram's heiress Claire Bronfman, also received significant prison sentences. The NXIVM case highlighted how modern cult organizations have evolved to exploit contemporary vulnerabilities. By positioning itself as a business training program rather than a religious movement, NXIVM attracted ambitious professionals who might have been skeptical of traditional religious recruitment. The organization's emphasis on rationality and scientific methodology appealed to educated individuals who prided themselves on logical thinking. The use of technology and modern business practices made NXIVM's manipulation more sophisticated than previous generations of cult organizations. The organization maintained detailed databases of member information, used encrypted communications to coordinate activities, and employed social media and professional networks for recruitment. This technological sophistication allowed for more precise targeting of potential victims and more effective control of existing members. NXIVM also exploited contemporary cultural themes around female empowerment and personal development. The organization's messaging about helping women overcome societal limitations and achieve their full potential resonated with many successful women who had experienced workplace discrimination or societal barriers. This made the eventual revelation of the systematic abuse and exploitation particularly traumatic for victims who had believed they were participating in their own empowerment. The financial resources available to NXIVM through wealthy members like Claire Bronfman enabled the organization to operate with a level of sophistication and persistence that would have been impossible for earlier cult groups. The ability to fund extensive legal battles, private investigations, and international operations allowed NXIVM to maintain its control systems and silence critics for nearly 2 decades. The psychological techniques employed by NXIVM represent an evolution in cult methodology that mental health professionals are still studying. The organization's use of concepts from legitimate psychology and business training created a veneer of credibility that made the underlying manipulation more difficult to recognize. Members genuinely believed they were participating in cutting-edge personal development rather than systematic psychological abuse. The NXIVM case serves as a crucial reminder that cult organizations continue to evolve and adapt to contemporary contexts. The traditional image of cults as isolated religious communities, led by charismatic prophets, no longer captures the full spectrum of these dangerous organizations. What makes these seemingly legitimate organizations so insidious is how they weaponized the very systems designed to protect victims. Understanding their methods reveals a chilling pattern of exploitation that extends far beyond individual harm. The legal systems that should have provided recourse became instruments of oppression. Scientology perfected this approach through what they called fair game, a policy that branded critics and defectors as enemies, deserving of harassment, litigation, and destruction. Former members describe coordinated campaigns involving private investigators following them, mysterious phone calls at all hours, and lawsuits designed not to win, but to financially drain opponents. The organization's legal department operated more like a military intelligence unit than a religious institution's administrative office. Their approach to litigation was particularly sophisticated. They would file dozens of simultaneous lawsuits against a single critic, forcing them to defend on multiple fronts while burning through their savings on legal fees. Even when Scientology lost these cases, they achieved their objective, silencing opposition through financial exhaustion. One former member described receiving over 40 separate legal threats in a single month, each requiring expensive legal consultation to address properly. The message was clear: challenging Scientology would cost everything you owned and more. NXAVM employed similar tactics, but with a more personalized approach. Keith Raniere maintained relationships with influential attorneys, judges, and political figures throughout New York State. When former members attempted to expose the organization, they found themselves facing criminal charges for alleged harassment or threatened with civil suits for breach of contract. The organization had members sign increasingly restrictive, non-disclosure agreements during their progression through the ranks, creating legal barriers to speaking out, even after they recognized the abuse. The DOS subgroup within NXIVM took legal intimidation to extreme levels. Women were required to provide collateral before joining, including compromising photographs, detailed confessions of supposed wrongdoing, and signed documents making false accusations against family members. This collateral served multiple purposes. It ensured silence, provided blackmail material, and created legal weapons against anyone who tried to leave. Sarah Edmondson, one of the first DOS members to speak publicly, described the terror of knowing that leaving meant potentially destroying her family relationships and professional reputation through the release of fabricated evidence. The aggressive Christianity Missionary Training Corps used a different but equally effective approach. They positioned themselves as a persecuted religious minority, claiming that any investigation or criticism was religious persecution. When child welfare agencies attempted to intervene, the group would relocate across state lines, taking advantage of jurisdictional complications and the constitutional protections afforded to religious organizations. They maintained legal residences in multiple states specifically to complicate law enforcement efforts. Their leaders, Jim and Lila Green, understood how to manipulate religious freedom protections. They framed their harsh disciplinary methods as religious practices, their isolation tactics as spiritual purification, and their financial exploitation as religious tithing. When former members attempted to bring criminal charges, prosecutors often found themselves navigating complex constitutional questions about religious autonomy versus child protection. The psychological warfare employed by these organizations was equally sophisticated. All three groups maintained extensive files on members, documenting their deepest fears, family relationships, financial situations, and personal vulnerabilities. This information became ammunition for targeted harassment campaigns designed to discredit anyone who challenged the organization. Scientology's approach to psychological manipulation was perhaps most systematic. They required members to undergo extensive auditing sessions where they revealed intimate details about their lives, relationships, and past experiences. These sessions were recorded and transcribed, creating detailed psychological profiles. When members attempted to leave or speak out, this information was weaponized against them. Former members described having their most private confessions broadcast to their families, employers, and communities as part of coordinated character assassination campaigns. The organization also employed techniques designed to make former members question their own memories and experiences. They would produce doctored audio recordings, manipulated photographs, and fabricated documents to contradict whistleblower accounts. This gaslighting approach proved remarkably effective, causing many former members to doubt their own experiences and retreat from public criticism. And M's psychological warfare was more intimate but equally destructive. Keith Raniere positioned himself as a brilliant philosopher and ethical teacher, causing members to internalize blame for any problems they experienced. When women in Daoist began questioning the increasingly extreme demands, they were told that their resistance indicated ethical failments that required correction through additional punishment and submission. The organization also employed sophisticated relationship manipulation. They encouraged members to recruit friends and family members, creating networks where leaving meant losing entire social circles. They arranged housing situations where multiple members lived together, making it difficult for individuals to maintain privacy or develop independent perspectives. Some members found themselves financially dependent on the organization through employment in NXMU-AM-affiliated businesses, creating additional barriers to departure. The aggressive Christianity Missionary Training Corps used religious manipulation to similar effect. They convinced members that leaving the organization meant abandoning God and ensuring eternal damnation. Children raised in the group were taught that questioning leadership was equivalent to questioning divine authority. This religious framework made it psychologically devastating for members to consider leaving, as doing so required abandoning not just their community, but their entire spiritual worldview. The organization also employed trauma bonding techniques, alternating harsh punishment with moments of approval and acceptance. Members developed strong emotional attachments to leaders who controlled both their suffering and relief. This created powerful psychological dependencies that persisted long after members physically left the organization. Understanding these sophisticated control mechanisms reveals why simply educating people about cult dangers is insufficient. These organizations evolved beyond simple manipulation into complex systems of control that exploited legal protections, psychological vulnerabilities, and social structures simultaneously. They didn't just recruit vulnerable individuals, they created vulnerability through systematic isolation, financial exploitation, and psychological conditioning. The financial dimensions of their control systems were particularly insidious. All three organizations structured their operations to maximize member dependency while generating substantial revenue for leadership. Scientology's auditing fees could easily exceed $100,000 for advanced levels, with members encouraged to take loans, sell property, or work in organization businesses to pay these costs. The financial investment became psychological leverage. Members who had spent their life savings were motivated to believe the organization was legitimate to avoid confronting the magnitude of their losses. NXIVM employed a similar model through its expensive workshops and coaching programs. Members were encouraged to take multiple courses, each costing thousands of dollars, with the promise that each level would unlock greater personal insights and abilities. The organization also operated businesses that employed members at below-market wages while charging premium prices for services, funneling money from members to leadership while deepening financial dependency. The aggressive Christianity Missionary Training Corps used religious tithing and communal living arrangements to achieve similar results. Members were expected to contribute their entire incomes to the organization while living in crowded, substandard conditions. This arrangement made leaving practically impossible for members who had no personal savings or assets outside the organization. These financial control mechanisms served multiple purposes beyond simple profit generation. They created practical barriers to leaving, psychological investment in the organization's legitimacy, and additional leverage for manipulation. Members who had sacrificed their financial security were vulnerable to threats about their ability to survive outside the organization. The international dimensions of these operations created additional complications for victims and investigators. Scientology operated in dozens of countries, moving money and personnel across borders to avoid oversight. When legal pressure mounted in one jurisdiction, they could shift operations elsewhere while maintaining their overall structure. Law enforcement had limited reach. Some DOS activities allegedly occurred in Mexico specifically to complicate potential criminal prosecutions. The psychological mechanics behind these organizations reveal something deeply unsettling about human nature itself. Each of these groups succeeded not because they offered something genuinely beneficial, but because they exploited fundamental vulnerabilities in the human psyche that we all possess. The need for meaning, for belonging, for transformation, for answers to life's most difficult questions. These are not weaknesses to be ashamed of, but rather essential aspects of what makes us human. Yet therein lies the danger. The aggressive Christianity Missionary Training Corps, the Church of Scientology, and NXEVM all began with promises that resonated with legitimate human desires. Who wouldn't want a deeper spiritual connection, enhanced personal abilities, or genuine self-improvement? The tragedy is that these organizations perverted these noble aspirations into instruments of control and exploitation. What makes these groups particularly insidious is their sophisticated understanding of psychological manipulation. They didn't simply prey on the desperate or the gullible. Instead, they developed systematic approaches to breaking down psychological defenses that could ensnare intelligent, educated, and otherwise capable individuals. The process was gradual, almost imperceptible, like a slow-acting poison that corrupts from within. Consider the common thread of isolation that runs through all three organizations. This wasn't accidental or coincidental. Isolation serves multiple purposes in the cult playbook. First, it removes external perspectives that might challenge the group's narrative. When you're surrounded only by believers who reinforce the same ideology, alternative viewpoints begin to seem not just wrong, but impossible. Second, isolation creates dependency. When the group becomes your only source of social connection, questioning the group means risking complete social annihilation. The financial exploitation employed by these organizations was equally calculated. By gradually extracting increasing amounts of money, they created what economists call the sunk cost fallacy on a massive scale. Members who had invested thousands or even hundreds of thousands of dollars faced a terrible choice: admit they had been deceived and lose everything, or continue investing in the hope of eventual payoff. The deeper the financial hole, the more difficult it became to climb out. Perhaps most disturbing was the way these groups weaponized shame and guilt. The aggressive Christianity Missionary Training Corps used religious language to convince members that questioning authority was tantamount to questioning God himself. Scientology created elaborate systems for confessing personal secrets, then used those confessions as leverage for control. NSIVM branded its victims literally and figuratively, creating physical and psychological scars that served as permanent reminders of submission. The legal strategies employed by these organizations demonstrate their awareness of their own criminality. They didn't operate in ignorance of the law, but rather developed sophisticated methods for circumventing it. They used religious freedom protections, complex corporate structures, and aggressive litigation tactics to shield themselves from accountability. They understood that the legal system's emphasis on individual choice and religious liberty could be exploited to protect their predatory practices. The testimonies of survivors reveal the long-lasting psychological damage inflicted by these groups. Many former members describe a process of recovery that takes years or even decades. They speak of learning to trust their own judgment again, of rebuilding relationships with family members they had been forced to abandon, of overcoming the deep-seated fear and shame that had been systematically implanted. Some survivors describe a phenomenon psychologists call learned helplessness, where the systematic breakdown of autonomy creates an inability to recognize or act upon opportunities for escape. Others speak of cognitive dissonance so severe that they continue to defend their abusers even after experiencing obvious harm. The human mind's capacity for self-deception, when properly manipulated, becomes a prison with invisible bars. The recruitment methods used by these organizations reveal their predatory nature. They didn't target random individuals, but rather those experiencing life transitions, personal crises, or spiritual searching. New college students, people going through divorces, individuals facing career changes, those dealing with loss or trauma. These are moments when people are most vulnerable, most open to new possibilities, and most susceptible to promises of transformation. The progressive nature of involvement in these groups is particularly chilling. No one joins a cult planning to surrender their autonomy, wealth, and relationships. Instead, they make small commitments that gradually escalate. They attend a free seminar, then a weekend workshop, then a more intensive program. Each step seems reasonable in isolation, but collectively they form a path toward total control. The role of social proof in these organizations cannot be understated. Seeing other intelligent, successful people involved provided validation for new recruits. If a doctor, lawyer, or business executive had committed to the group, surely it must be legitimate. These organizations carefully cultivated high-profile members and used their success stories as recruitment tools, often omitting the darker aspects of their experiences. Technology and modern communication methods have made these groups even more dangerous. Online recruitment allows them to cast wider nets and identify vulnerable individuals more efficiently. Social media provides detailed information about potential targets' interests, relationships, and psychological states. Digital communication creates records that can be used for blackmail while appearing to offer privacy and security. The global reach of organizations like Scientology demonstrates how these groups can transcend national boundaries and legal jurisdictions. They establish operations in countries with different legal frameworks, allowing them to forum shop for the most favorable regulatory environments. They use international structures to move money and resources beyond the reach of any single government's oversight. What makes recovery particularly challenging is that these groups don't simply take money or time, they fundamentally alter their victims' sense of reality. Former members often describe feeling like they're learning to see the world clearly for the first time in years. Basic concepts like trust, authority, and personal autonomy must be rebuilt from scratch. The process is not just about leaving an organization, but about reconstructing an entire worldview. The impact on families is devastating and often permanent. Children who grew up in these environments, like those in the aggressive Christianity Missionary Training Corps, face unique challenges. They must overcome not just personal trauma, but also educational deficits, social isolation, and a complete lack of preparation for life in the outside world. Many struggle with basic skills that most people take for granted. The stories of these three organizations serve as a warning about the vulnerability of human psychology and the ease with which noble impulses can be corrupted. They remind us that the search for meaning, improvement, and connection, while essential to human flourishing, must be approached with wisdom, skepticism, and the support of genuine community. Perhaps most importantly, these cases demonstrate that evil often comes disguised as good. The most dangerous predators are not those who announce their malicious intentions, but those who wrap their exploitation in the language of salvation, enlightenment, and empowerment. They succeed because they offer real benefits alongside their harm, making it difficult for victims to recognize the true nature of their situation until it may be too late. The legacy of these organizations continues to unfold as survivors come forward, legal proceedings advance, and society grapples with how to prevent similar groups from causing future harm. The most chilling aspect of these organizations isn't their individual crimes, but how they've refined the art of psychological warfare into a science. Each group represents decades of evolution in human manipulation, creating blueprints that continue to influence how modern predators operate. Understanding their methods isn't just about examining historical curiosities. It's about recognizing the patterns that persist today in countless smaller groups, online communities, and even corporate environments where power dynamics create opportunities for exploitation. The aggressive Christianity Missionary Training Corps perfected the formula of combining religious fervor with military style conditioning. Their approach demonstrates how genuine spiritual seeking can be weaponized through sleep deprivation, physical hardship, and the gradual erosion of individual identity. What makes their methodology particularly insidious is how they frame abuse as divine testing. Members endure psychological torture, believing it brings them closer to God, creating a feedback loop where suffering becomes proof of spiritual progress. The group's emphasis on apocalyptic preparation serves dual purposes. It justifies extreme measures while creating an us versus them mentality that makes questioning the leadership equivalent to betraying salvation itself. Former members could describe a systematic process of breaking down personality defenses. New recruits undergo intensive indoctrination sessions lasting 16 to 18 hours daily. These sessions combine biblical study with increasingly personal confessions, where individuals reveal their deepest fears, shames, and desires. This information becomes ammunition for later psychological manipulation. Leaders use these revelations to craft personalized pressure campaigns, exploiting specific vulnerabilities to maintain control. The genius of this approach lies in how it masquerades as spiritual guidance while systematically destroying the victim's ability to think independently. The Church of Scientology elevated these techniques into what can only be described as psychological engineering. Their approach demonstrates how pseudo-scientific language can legitimize abuse while creating an elaborate mythology that justifies increasingly extreme demands. Scientology's genius lies in its progressive revelation system. New members receive seemingly helpful self-improvement techniques that produce genuine short-term benefits. These early wins create investment and credibility that the organization later exploits as it introduces more controversial practices and financial demands. The auditing process represents perhaps the most sophisticated psychological manipulation technique ever developed by a modern organization. Under the guise of spiritual counseling, members reveal their most intimate secrets, fears, and transgressions while connected to a primitive lie detector device. These sessions create detailed psychological profiles that the organization uses for blackmail and control. More insidiously, the process creates artificial emotional highs and lows that members interpret as spiritual breakthroughs, fostering addiction to the auditing experience itself. Scientology's fair game policy demonstrates how these groups institutionalize revenge against those who threaten their control. Former members face systematic harassment campaigns designed to destroy their careers, relationships, and mental health. Private investigators follow them, their employers receive defamatory materials, and they're subjected to frivolous lawsuits designed to bankrupt them through legal fees. This campaign serves as both punishment and deterrent, sending a clear message to current members about the consequences of defection. The policy's effectiveness lies not just in its brutality, but in how it's implemented through seemingly legitimate channels that make victims appear paranoid when they seek help. NXIVM represents the evolution of these techniques into the digital age, showing how charismatic leaders can exploit contemporary self-improvement culture to create modern slavery. Keith Raniere's approach demonstrates the power of combining ancient cult techniques with modern psychology and technology. The organization's executive success programs appeared to be standard corporate training, using familiar concepts like limiting beliefs and personal responsibility to gain credibility with successful professionals. The brilliance of NXIVM's approach lay in its recruitment strategy. Rather than targeting vulnerable individuals, they specifically pursued high-achieving women who could serve as both financial resources and recruiting tools. These accomplished individuals brought credibility, connections, and substantial resources to the organization. Their success stories became powerful recruiting tools, suggesting that NXEVM's techniques could enhance already impressive achievements. This created a feedback loop where success attracted more successful people, gradually building a network of influential members who were heavily invested in the organization's legitimacy. The DOS sorority represents the ultimate expression of how these groups weaponize intimacy and trust. By requiring increasingly personal collateral, members gradually surrendered their ability to leave, while becoming more deeply enmeshed in the organization's control structure. The branding ceremony serves as perhaps the most chilling example of how psychological manipulation can lead intelligent, accomplished individuals to accept treatment they would never tolerate under normal circumstances. The fact that victims participated willingly, even enthusiastically, demonstrates the terrifying effectiveness of gradual psychological conditioning. What makes these organizations particularly dangerous is their institutional nature. Unlike individual predators who rely on personal charisma, these groups create systems that can outlast their founders. They develop training materials, standardized procedures, and organizational structures that allow the abuse to continue even when leadership changes. They also create legal and financial frameworks that protect their operations while maximizing their ability to exploit members. This systematization means that the techniques they develop can be copied, modified, and implemented by other groups worldwide. The legal strategies employed by these organizations reveal another dimension of their sophistication. They exploit religious freedom protections, corporate structures, and jurisdictional complexities to shield their operations from oversight. They maintain teams of lawyers who specialize in intimidating critics and former members through aggressive litigation. They create complex financial structures that make it difficult for authorities to trace money flows or hold individuals accountable for organizational crimes. Most insidiously, they often position themselves as victims of persecution, using legitimate concerns about religious freedom to deflect criticism of their abusive practices. The technological tools available to modern groups amplify these traditional techniques in unprecedented ways. Digital communication allows for constant monitoring and control of members' activities. Social media provides detailed intelligence about potential recruits and their psychological vulnerabilities. Online platforms enable groups to spread their influence globally while maintaining centralized control. Cryptocurrency and digital payment systems make financial exploitation harder to track and regulate. These technological capabilities mean that future iterations of these organizations may be even more dangerous than their predecessors. The psychological damage inflicted by these groups extends far beyond their immediate victims. Family members and friends watch helplessly as loved ones disappear into closed systems that systematically alienate them from outside relationships. Communities lose valuable members to organizations that contribute nothing to society while draining resources and destroying lives. The broader culture suffers as these groups undermine trust in legitimate institutions and spiritual practices by associating them with exploitation and abuse. Understanding these organizations requires acknowledging an uncomfortable truth about human nature. The needs they exploit, belonging, purpose, transcendence, spiritual growth, are fundamental aspects of the human experience. Their success reveals how desperately people seek meaning and connection in an increasingly fragmented world. This desperation creates opportunities for exploitation that will always exist in some form. The challenge isn't eliminating these needs, but creating healthy alternatives that fulfill them without demanding the surrender of individual autonomy and critical thinking. The stories of survivors provide both hope and warning for the future. Their courage in speaking out despite enormous personal costs has exposed these organizations' methods and helped others avoid similar fates. Their recovery journeys demonstrate that even severe psychological manipulation can be overcome with proper support and treatment. The shadows cast by these organizations stretch far beyond their immediate victims. Understanding how cults like the aggressive Christianity Missionary Training Corps, Church of Scientology, and NXIVM operate reveals critical patterns that extend throughout society. Their sophisticated manipulation techniques mirror tactics used by authoritarian regimes, abusive relationships, and even certain corporate environments. The psychological principles they exploit remain constant, regardless of the specific ideology they claim to represent. What makes these groups particularly insidious is their ability to adapt and evolve. When legal pressure mounts in one jurisdiction, they shift operations to more permissive locations. When traditional recruitment methods become scrutinized, they pivot to digital platforms and social media campaigns. The aggressive Christianity Missionary Training Corps demonstrated this adaptability by repeatedly relocating their compounds across state and national borders whenever local authorities began investigating their practices. The Church of Scientology has perhaps perfected this evolutionary approach, transforming from a relatively small organization into a multinational enterprise with real estate holdings worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Their ability to simultaneously present themselves as a legitimate religion while maintaining the rigid control structures of a totalitarian system shows how these groups can exist within democratic societies by exploiting the very freedoms those societies protect. NXIVM's trajectory illustrates another crucial aspect of cult evolution. They successfully marketed themselves as a cutting-edge personal development company, attracting highly educated professionals, celebrities, and business leaders. This wasn't accidental. Modern cults increasingly target successful individuals who possess resources, influence, and social networks that can be exploited for recruitment and legitimacy. The financial structures these organizations develop deserve particular attention. Each group created multiple layers of financial obligation designed to trap members in escalating cycles of debt and dependency. The aggressive Christianity Missionary Training Corps required members to surrender all personal assets while simultaneously demanding they fund the organization's activities. Scientology's complex pricing structure for spiritual advancement can cost individuals hundreds of thousands of dollars over their lifetime involvement. NXIVM members paid for increasingly expensive courses while being pressured to recruit others who would generate additional revenue streams. These financial entanglements serve multiple purposes beyond simple profit generation. They create sunk cost fallacies where members feel they must continue participating to justify their previous investments. They establish artificial scarcity by making advancement dependent on financial commitment. Most importantly, they create practical barriers to leaving by ensuring members have depleted their resources and damaged their credit during their involvement. The legal strategies employed by these groups reveal another layer of their sophistication. Rather than simply avoiding law enforcement, they actively weaponize legal systems against critics, former members, and investigators. Scientology's aggressive litigation tactics have become legendary, with the organization filing hundreds of lawsuits against perceived enemies while simultaneously infiltrating government agencies to gather intelligence on their operations. This legal warfare serves multiple functions. It drains resources from opponents who cannot match the organization's legal budgets. It creates fear among potential critics who worry about becoming targets themselves. It generates extensive documentation that can be used to intimidate and harass individuals for years after initial conflicts end. The psychological impact of prolonged legal harassment often proves more damaging than any actual court outcomes. The role of technology in modern cult operations cannot be understated. These organizations were early adopters of digital surveillance, data collection, and online influence campaigns. NXIVM utilized sophisticated software to track member communications and behavior patterns. Scientology has invested heavily in digital infrastructure to monitor both members and critics across multiple platforms. The aggressive Christianity Missionary Training Corps, despite their seemingly low-tech religious presentation, employed complex communication networks to coordinate activities across their global operations. Social media platforms have become particularly valuable recruiting tools. These organizations create seemingly innocent content about self-improvement, spiritual growth, or community building that attracts vulnerable individuals. The algorithms that power these platforms can inadvertently amplify cult content by connecting people who share similar interests or struggles. Once initial contact is established, recruitment moves to private channels where more intensive manipulation can occur without public scrutiny. The intergenerational impact of cult involvement creates additional layers of trauma and control. Children born into these environments often suffer from developmental delays, educational neglect, and severe social isolation. The aggressive Christianity Missionary Training Corps particularly exemplified this pattern, with children receiving minimal formal education while being subjected to harsh disciplinary practices and adult responsibilities from very young ages. These second-generation members face unique challenges when attempting to leave. They often lack basic life skills, educational credentials, or social connections outside the organization. Their entire worldview has been shaped by cult doctrine, making it extremely difficult to develop critical thinking skills or recognize manipulation. Many require years of intensive therapy and support services to successfully integrate into mainstream society. The therapeutic community has developed increasingly sophisticated approaches to helping cult survivors, but resources remain limited compared to the scope of the problem. Effective treatment requires understanding not just individual trauma, but the complex systems of control these organizations employ. Traditional therapy models often prove inadequate for addressing the specific psychological damage caused by systematic manipulation, social isolation, and identity destruction. Recovery involves multiple phases that can span many years. Initial safety and stabilization focuses on meeting basic needs and establishing physical security. Many survivors struggle with housing, employment, and financial stability after leaving groups that controlled every aspect of their daily lives. The intermediate phase involves processing trauma and developing healthy relationships while learning to trust their own judgment again. Long-term recovery requires ongoing support as survivors navigate major life decisions without the rigid structure they previously relied upon. Support networks for survivors have emerged organically, often led by former members who understand the unique challenges of cult recovery. These communities provide practical assistance, emotional support, and advocacy services that formal mental health systems struggle to deliver. However, they also face ongoing harassment and legal challenges from the organizations their members have escaped. The broader implications for society extend beyond individual cases of abuse. These organizations demonstrate how democratic institutions and legal protections can be manipulated by groups with sufficient resources and determination. They exploit religious freedom protections, corporate legal structures, and international jurisdictional complexities to operate with minimal oversight. Their success reveals vulnerabilities in systems designed to protect legitimate religious and educational activities. Educational initiatives have become crucial for prevention efforts. Teaching critical thinking skills, emotional intelligence, and awareness of manipulation techniques can help individuals recognize and resist cult recruitment. However, these programs often struggle for funding and institutional support, particularly when they challenge popular self-help movements or spiritual practices that may employ similar techniques. The digital age has both amplified cult risks and created new opportunities for awareness and intervention. Former members can now share their experiences through podcasts, documentaries, and social media platforms, reaching audiences that traditional media might not serve. This grassroots education effort has proven remarkably effective at exposing cult practices and supporting survivors. Law enforcement approaches have evolved significantly as understanding of cult operations has improved. Rather than waiting for obvious criminal violations, investigators now focus on financial crimes, immigration violations, and civil rights abuses that may be easier to prosecute. Multi-jurisdictional cooperation has improved as agencies recognize that these organizations deliberately exploit jurisdictional boundaries. International cooperation remains challenging but increasingly necessary. Many modern cults operate across multiple countries, moving resources and personnel to avoid accountability. Extradition treaties, mutual legal assistance agreements, and diplomatic pressure have become important tools for addressing organizations that exploit international borders. The stories of the Aggressive Christianity, Missionary Training Corps, Church of Scientology, and NXIVM serve as cautionary tales about the persistence and adaptability of exploitative organizations. They remind us that the human desires for meaning, community, and personal growth that make us vulnerable to manipulation are also fundamental aspects of healthy human development. The challenge lies in protecting these essential needs while developing immunity to those who would exploit them. Understanding these organizations ultimately reveals something profound about human nature itself. We are social beings who seek purpose, belonging, and transcendence. These fundamental drives cannot be eliminated, nor should they be. Instead, we must develop the wisdom to distinguish between authentic opportunities for growth and sophisticated systems of exploitation that masquerade as spiritual or personal development. The fight against destructive cults is ultimately a fight for human dignity and freedom. It requires vigilance, education, and compassion for both potential victims and survivors. Most importantly, it demands that we create healthy alternatives that meet the legitimate needs these organizations pretend to serve. Only by building stronger communities, more meaningful relationships, and authentic opportunities for personal growth can we reduce the appeal of those who would manipulate our deepest human longings for their own gain.